The Dollmaker's curse. The rain began around twilight, falling in steady sheets that made the pavement glisten like black ice. I had no intention of venturing far from home that night, but my curiosity had a way of steering me into places I didn't belong. I was walking the unfamiliar streets of the old quarter, my breath curling in the cold air, when I saw it. Thorne's Doll Emporium. The sign hung precariously above the door, its edges worn by time and weather. The shop itself seemed carved out of the shadows, its windows fogged over, revealing only faint silhouettes of its contents. What caught my attention, though, wasn't the shop but the note pinned to the door. Help wanted. Emporium caretaker. 1 night only. Generous pay. It seemed ridiculous, almost a joke. But the thought of easy money flickered through my mind, and before I could second-guess myself, I was knocking on the heavy wooden door. It creaked open with a reluctance that sent a shiver down my spine. The man standing there was bent with age, his gnarled hands gripping the edge of the door frame. His face was a latticework of wrinkles, and his eyes, so pale they were nearly white, bore into me. "You're here for the job," he said, his voice a brittle whisper that left no room for denial. I nodded, though I hadn't yet spoken. He led me inside without a word. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something faintly sweet, like decaying flowers. The walls were lined with shelves crowded with dolls of every shape and size. Each was unnervingly lifelike, their glass eyes catching the dim light in a way that made them seem alive. The man handed me a key and gestured toward the counter. "Stay until dawn," he said, his lips barely moving. "Don't touch the dolls. Just keep watch." Before I could ask questions, he shuffled toward the back of the shop and disappeared behind a curtain. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. At first, the job seemed easy. The shop was still, the only sound my own footsteps as I moved around to get a closer look at the dolls. They came in all forms: porcelain ballerinas, ragged cloth children, wooden marionettes with strings that hung limply from their joints. But there was something strange about them. Their expressions were too vivid, too detailed. I caught myself glancing at them more than I intended, half expecting one to blink. Around midnight, the unease began to creep in. I was leaning against the counter, flipping through an old magazine I'd found when I felt it, a sensation like being watched. My eyes darted toward the shelves where rows of doll eyes gleamed in the faint light. It was absurd. Of course, they weren't watching me. They couldn't be. I laughed to myself, a hollow sound in the stillness. But the moment I did, I saw it. A doll perched on a high shelf, its porcelain face painted with delicate care. It was smiling. That wouldn't have been strange, except I was certain it hadn't been smiling before. I stood, my heart thudding in my chest, and approached the doll. Its smile was faint but unmistakable, its tiny mouth curved upward in a way that felt mocking. I reached out to touch it but stopped myself. The old man's words echoed in my mind. "Don't touch the dolls." I backed away, returning to the counter. But the feeling didn't leave. I glanced at another doll, a plump toddler sitting in a wooden cradle. Its blue eyes seemed fixed on me, unblinking. When I shifted, they seemed to follow. I could no longer deny it. Something was wrong. The first noise came then, a faint rustling that made me freeze. It sounded like dry leaves brushing against each other, but it was coming from the shelves. Slowly I turned, scanning the room. The dolls were still, their faces unchanged, but the sound persisted, growing louder, closer. "Hello?" My voice trembled in the silence. No response. But I swear I saw movement, a flicker of shadow among the dolls. My pulse quickened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I decided to leave. Enough was enough. I turned to the door, gripping the key tightly and twisted it in the lock. It wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the key stuck as though the lock itself refused to let me out. My breathing quickened as I pulled and yanked, but the door remained unyielding. Behind me, the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. And then, from the cradle, a faint, childlike giggle echoed through the room. I turned slowly toward the sound, my grip on the useless key tightening. The toddler doll sat as before, its blue eyes wide and guileless. But now, there was something different. A faint curl at the corners of its painted lips. A smile. The giggle echoed again, softer this time, but unmistakable, as if it were mocking me. I stepped back, heart pounding, the back of my knees hitting the counter. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer with every flicker of the dim overhead light. I forced myself to look away from the doll, but as I scanned the room, I saw more changes. The ballerina doll, perched high on the shelf, had shifted slightly. Her delicate arm extended toward me, the tip of her porcelain finger pointing like an accusation. A marionette on the opposite wall dangled limply from its strings, but its head had turned sharply, its painted grin wide and menacing. It wasn't possible. They hadn't moved. I would have noticed, wouldn't I? I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. The noise echoed in the oppressive silence, and suddenly the rustling resumed. Louder, angrier, as if the dolls themselves were protesting my presence. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. Desperation drove me to act. I needed to know what was happening, to understand why I couldn't leave. My eyes landed on the curtain at the back of the shop, the one the old man had disappeared behind hours ago. He must still be here. He had to be. I pushed through the curtain, half expecting to find him waiting, his pale eyes gleaming with some sinister secret. Instead, I was met with darkness. The air was colder here, heavier, and the faint smell of decay was stronger, more cloying. "Hello?" My voice trembled, swallowed by the shadows. No answer. My fingers fumbled along the wall until they found a switch. Light flooded the room, revealing a small workbench covered in tools and scraps of fabric. More dolls were scattered across the surface, some in various stages of completion, arms missing, heads detached. But what caught my attention was a leather-bound journal lying open in the center of the table. I hesitated, but the rustling behind me grew louder, more insistent, driving me forward. I picked up the journal, its brittle pages crackling beneath my fingers, and began to read. The words were disjointed, written in a spidery scrawl that was difficult to decipher. But the message was clear enough. The dolls were cursed. Created by the shop's original owner, Thorne himself, they were designed to reflect the emotions of those who cared for them. Happiness, sadness, anger, fear. Whatever the caretaker felt, the dolls would mimic. But there was a price. The more the dolls mirrored their caretaker's emotions, the more they fed on their vitality. Thorne had discovered this too late, the journal explained, and had paid the ultimate price. His spirit was bound to the shop, to the dolls, and the curse continued through whoever dared to take his place. The realization hit me like a blow. The old man hadn't been a bystander. He'd been a victim, just like I was now. He'd passed the burden to me, and unless I found a way to break the curse, I would suffer the same fate. I turned the page and found a final entry. A ritual, hastily scrawled, offering a slim chance at salvation. Confront your reflection in the mirror. Accept your truth. Force the dolls to release their hold. The mirror. My gaze snapped to the antique oval mirror hanging in the corner of the workshop. Its surface was dark, almost liquid, as though it were waiting for me. I approached the mirror cautiously, the journal clutched in one hand. The doll's rustling had stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence that made my every footstep echo louder than it should. I didn't trust the stillness. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. As I neared the mirror, my reflection came into view. Or rather, what I thought was my reflection. The figure staring back at me wasn't quite right. Its features were mine, but twisted, exaggerated. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, its lips curled into a sneer. It didn't move when I did, its head cocked slightly as if mocking me. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the journal's warning. The mirror would show my truest self, and I had to accept what I saw. "I can do this," I whispered, more to myself than to the reflection. But before I could utter the incantation, the mirror shimmered, and the image inside began to shift. The reflection smiled, wider and wider, until its lips stretched impossibly far, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Behind it, the dolls appeared, their eyes glowing faintly as they loomed closer. I stumbled back, but the workshop was no longer empty. The dolls surrounded me, their once innocent faces now grotesque and contorted, their glassy eyes filled with malice. The ballerina doll clutched a shard of broken porcelain, and the toddler doll crawled toward me, its laughter echoing in the confined space. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to focus. I turned back to the mirror, locking eyes with the monstrous reflection. My hands trembled as I began to speak the incantation. "Through the glass, my truth will pass. Release your hold. This curse I cast." The words felt heavy, each one resonating through the room. The reflection screamed, its face cracking like shattered glass, and the dolls writhed, their movements jerky and frantic. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the shop seemed to groan around me. I shouted the incantation again, louder this time, pouring every ounce of willpower into the words. The reflection's face shattered completely, and the mirror erupted in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the dolls lay still, their faces blank and lifeless once more. The shop was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. But as I turned toward the door, the faintest sound reached my ears, a whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Not over yet." The door creaked open and I fled into the night, leaving the cursed shop behind. But even now, as I write this, I can feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching me. And when I glance at my reflection, it still lingers, just a moment too long, as if something is waiting to emerge. I stumbled into the cold night air, the door to Thorne's Doll Emporium slamming shut behind me. The rain had stopped, but the street was unnervingly quiet, the lamps casting dim halos of light that barely pierced the darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the shop's oppressive atmosphere clinging to me like a second skin. I didn't look back. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my limbs aching as if I'd run for miles. My mind raced, replaying the events in the shop, the dolls, the mirror, the reflection that wasn't mine. My hands shook, the phantom weight of the journal still etched into my palms. It was over, I told myself, but the words felt hollow. I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it, though I wasn't sure what I was locking out. The familiar surroundings of my living room did little to ease my nerves. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and the silence was too complete, too deliberate. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. The curse was broken. The mirror had shattered. The dolls had fallen lifeless. It was over. But the whisper started again. Soft at first, barely audible, like a faint rustling at the edge of my hearing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned to the mirror above my fireplace. It was just a cheap thing I'd bought years ago, its silver frame tarnished with age. At least it had been. Now, the frame gleamed, pristine, and the surface of the glass shimmered like liquid. My reflection stared back at me, but its expression was wrong. Its lips curled upward in a grin I wasn't wearing. I stumbled back, and the reflection leaned closer, its hands pressing against the inside of the glass. My breath caught in my throat as it whispered, "You can't escape." The glass rippled, and the reflection reached through. The last thing I remember was the sensation of cold hands wrapping around my throat, pulling me closer to the mirror's surface as the world around me dissolved into darkness. Now, when people walk past my apartment, they swear they hear faint laughter, and sometimes a whisper calling their name.